Don't forget, as always, you can follow us on the social medias: Twitter, Moncton Wildcast; Instagram, Wildcast Podcast; TikTok, Wildcast Podcast; and of course, like and subscribe on our YouTube. Don't forget to click the little bell because sometimes the podcast post game shows up there and you don't want to miss it. Now, you had a tweet following up on that, that we could see some Russian and Belarusians potentially coming back to the CHL. I just want to get do you have any more info on that? We talked about a little bit on our show about how it's kind of time to have the best players representing in the CHL, but also maybe down the line with the World Juniors. But any more info that you have on that kind of scenario that you tweeted out I think a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, a very sort of fluid thing. Certainly nothing set in stone, but there have been discussions about lifting the CHL import draft ban on Russian and Belarusian players. I know certainly agents have pushed hard for it. There is a lineup of kids in Russia and in Belarus who want to come over here and play in the CHL. There are recent success stories in the USHL, so there's a bit of a war that is being lost here, if you will, by in terms of on the ice by the CHL by allowing these players to go south of the border and play. Artem Levshunov is going to be a potential second or third overall pick in this year's draft. His preference was to play in the CHL, but he didn't have that option. He's a kid from Belarus who went over and played in the USHL in Green Bay last year and is now a star at Michigan State University in the NCAA. He was never planning to go the NCAA route. Matvey Gridin of the Muskegon Lumberjacks is another player. He's a Russian, not a Belarusian, who has been a star for Muskegon in the USHL this season. He's now headed to Michigan. I know his preference also was to come over originally and to play in the CHL. So there are players that are eager to get back into the CHL. There are agents that would rather their clients be in the CHL than in the USHL in terms of development and in terms of getting recognized by NHL scouts. But ultimately, it's a very layered thing as well. It's not as simple as the CHL deciding to lift the ban. Mm-hmm. They also need to make sure that these kids can get their visas approved. Adar Sanayev, for example, a player who was drafted by the Calgary Flames in last year's draft, had major visa issues, both in Canada and now getting into college in the States. He was originally committed to Harvard and had to recommit to UMass because Harvard wasn't going to accept him due to being Russian and because he was having visa issues. So there's a Canadian government aspect to lifting the ban as well, where the CHL is going to need assurances from the Canadian government that if they lift the ban, that the players are going to get visas and they're going to be able to come over here and play. There's no guarantee that the Canadian government wants these kids coming over here to play. In many cases, believe it or not, these kids come from very wealthy Russian families. In many cases, their parents are involved in the Russian government. So there's all sorts of layers to sort of getting Russian players back over here. And it's a very complicated issue, obviously, with the geopolitics of it all. So it's being discussed. It's something that I think the CHL isn't necessarily opposed to changing at this point. It's just a matter of, okay, what does that look like? And is it practical? And what are the logistics in terms of actually getting players back over here and getting players reintegrated and visas and translators and all of that? They've got to open up those doors again. So we'll see what happens. But I would not be shocked if for ahead of the import draft in the spring, if there's some sort of announcement about a change.
So I wonder if, sorry, before you go, Jeremy, I wonder if there'd be a situation with like a transfer portal, or if you wanted to take one of those kids that's playing in the UCHL, if they open that up, or if it would strictly be you have to draft a player from across the ocean.
I think the most likely outcome is that there's no sort of USHL forgiveness. There are already pretty strict rules in place about players who commit to college and play in the USHL and not being able to re-enter into the CHL. There have only ever been rare exceptions to that. Obviously, Matthew Savoy went down and played in the USHL during the pandemic. That was largely because the WHL wasn't operating. Cole Sillinger did the same thing, played a year in the USHL because the WHL wasn't operating during the pandemic. He would have been he ended up going right to surprise some people and went right to Columbus in the NHL after that. Mm-hmm. But he would have technically been eligible to return to Medicine Hat, who owned his rights and play in Medicine Hat. So there are layers to it. Obviously, a few players in recent years. Chaz Lucius recently decommitted from college after playing a year at the University of Minnesota and went and played for the Portland Winterhawks. Kiefer Bellows did the same thing. So there are rules that allow college players to return, but often in cases, if you've chosen the USHL, it becomes very difficult for you to go either from the USHL to the CHL or from the CHL to the USHL. So my guess is that door won't be open for Russian players that are already in the USHL, and that it would just be players who are currently playing in Russia that then become, and Belarusia, or Belarus, I should say, who are then allowed to sort of participate in the draft again.
Follow us on social media at Moncton Wildcast.